But welcome everyone to our event this evening. If you got the same notification that I got when I joined, Zoom greeted me by saying you have now joined Catastrophe, which is an apt way to describe what we'll be talking about tonight, the environmental impacts of nuclear weapons. So for those that I've not met before, my name's Ross Greer. I'm an MSP for the West of Scotland, and I'm the Deputy Convener of the Scottish Parliament's cross-party group on nuclear disarmament. I'm also the International Affairs and Defence and Security spokesperson for my group here in the Parliament, the Green Group. And I'm really looking forward to tonight's discussion, which is perhaps a slightly odd thing to say given the topic and given the rather negative realities of the situation that we'll be discussing. But I think on the eve of COP, with the world coming here to Scotland, to discuss what we now need to do to head off climate catastrophe or further climate catastrophe, it is absolutely appropriate for us to be discussing the environmental impacts of nuclear weapons, and particularly for those of us here in the UK to do so given our country's legacy, but also the current reality of the contribution that the UK makes through this. So I'm not going to take up any more of our time because I'm certainly not the expert that you've all came here to hear from. I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Richard Dixon, who's the Chief Executive of Friends of the Earth Scotland, who will be chairing this evening's event.
Thank you very much, Ross. And I'll just make a few introductory remarks. Obviously, at Friends of the Earth, we're very busy preparing for the climate conference in Glasgow next week. And I spend much of my day telling people that climate change is the biggest threat. But I have to admit that there are some other biggest threats. There's asteroids impacts, there's pandemics with something worse than COVID-19. But of course, there's also all-out nuclear war. And that's always been on my mind. And the final one could, of course, give us nuclear winter. So another sort of climate change. So to me, in the whole of my life, the threat of nuclear war has always been a big concern and a passion for me. But of course, it's not just, are we going to have a war that can be completely devastating catastrophe? It's the everyday impacts and risks, the catastrophe for individuals that we're here to talk about as well. So that's from routine and accidental releases of radioactivity, whether that's a submarine passing by down a Scottish loch, or it's living next to a weapons dump in the former Soviet Union. There's the impacts of mining, we're going to talk about that. There's the legacy of testing, and we're going to talk about that, and questions of waste storage, as well as, of course, the risks of accidents, including the crazy practice of routinely driving warheads from the south of England through the central belt of Scotland to take them to Faslane and Coolport. So there is plenty to talk about. There's plenty of stuff that we should all be concerned about. And I'm glad to say we've got three great speakers we're going to hear from who are going to talk about the impact of nuclear weapons, the industry, the legacy in other parts of the world. So I will introduce each one as they speak. We're going to start with Leona Morgan. She's been working on uranium mining since 2007. She's from the indigenous Diné people of the southeastern part of the US, and she lives in Albuquerque in New Mexico. And she's also been fighting a proposal for storage, high-level radioactive waste storage from nuclear power plants in New Mexico. So Leona, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you. I'm so honored to be here with you all. And I want to just start off by introducing myself in my people's language. My people are indigenous to the Southwest United States. So I'll start with that, and then I have a slide presentation for you all. Yat e she e torich eatni nishle tena bithni bashish chinki ani dashiche ohuglini dashinella. She e Leona Morgan inche. Beldi that senilde shagan ado uranium ado nuclear issues banashnish. So I just wanted to explain a little bit before I start talking that I don't live in an impacted community. We're going to hear from Tina, who will talk about some impacts from the first nuclear test. I live in New Mexico, which as a state has a lot of nuclear facilities. And it's really my family, my parents, my uncles, my aunties, a lot of my relatives, my grandparents who have died from different cancers. And today there's still babies being born. There was a study, and today Diné babies are being born with uranium in their urine. So this is newborn babies. So even though the things we're going to talk about started over 75 years ago, these things are still hurting our people today. And so I will start with this definition of nuclear colonialism, and it's put together by a few folks, including Winona LaDuke and a friend of mine named Clee Benally, who talks about nuclear colonialism as a slow genocide. And I'll read the definition for you, and it's the nuclear colonialism is the systematic dispossession of indigenous lands, exploitation of cultural resources, and the subjugation and oppression of indigenous peoples to further nuclear production of energy and proliferation of weapons from uranium mining, processing, weapons testing, and waste storage, resulting in the destruction of indigenous peoples or genocide and cultures, and the creation of national sacrifice zones. So right now in New Mexico, I live in New Mexico, like I said, which is right here. So for those of you, this is the United States, and right here is where I live. I live right here in the center, and Tina is going to talk today about the Trinity test that occurred right about here, and the fallout went all over the country. But before I start talking about nuclear issues, I want to just emphasize, as an Indigenous person, our people, we still have our cultural ways intact. We still have our sacred places, our prayers, our rituals, our stories, all of that, it's still there. And some of the sacred places, such as sacred mountains, where there's uranium, those are being threatened, which hurts our culture. And this is not just for my people, this is for Indigenous peoples worldwide. So Indigenous peoples in other countries and other places, we're experiencing very similar effects. And so I just want to note that even in Greenland, I met some of the folks over there fighting uranium mining. They also eat sheep. My people eat sheep, a lot of similarities. So I just want to move forward and explain on the Navajo Nation. This is my people. We have our own government called the Navajo Nation, and there has been a lot of coal mining and fracking. So this is a methane spot. Our Navajo Nation is about right here. And so you can see this red spot here. They attribute it a lot to fossil fuels. So all of this fossil fuel development here is in an area that has uranium. So when they're taking coal out of the ground, or they're fracking and doing all of these other activities, the ground is still releasing radiation and different minerals. There's no more mining on our nation. The Navajo Nation here made a law to stop mining in 2005. And we also made a law to stop transport of radioactive materials in 2012. So right now, I'm going to move into talking more about the uranium history, but I just want to emphasize, in a lot of places where there's resource extraction of other minerals, we might be talking about uranium, but there's other types of contamination. And this is important when we're talking about transition, because people are saying, oh, we need to transition to a new energy, but that means mineral extraction for things needed for batteries, like lithium and cobalt. So I just want to keep that in mind, that when we're talking about mineral extraction, the effects are similar to people when it comes to contamination of our water and our food resources. And then there's always risk of accidents, like this was a fire in the fracking area. It was not really put on the news, and the communities were not prepared when this happened. It was a horrible accident, and a lot of our people in the middle of the night, they were stranded with no, they weren't ready. That was one of the issues we're concerned about when it comes to nuclear accidents. So now I want to talk really just about uranium and nuclear energy. Tina will talk more about nuclear weapons, but both come from uranium. And the reason why nuclear is a false solution to climate change is because nuclear is not carbon free. What they do is they calculate the carbon footprint of nuclear only at the power plant. So all of the footprint from the what we call the front end stages, so uranium mining, processing, fuel fabrication, none of that is counted. The transportation, which is around the world, none of that is counted in the carbon footprint of nuclear. And the waste storage, this is the most toxic stuff on the planet, and it'll be radioactive for hundreds of thousands of years. Some people say into the millions. That is not included in the carbon footprint. And so this is why nuclear is not a solution. We have no solution to the waste. And so high-level radioactive waste that comes out of nuclear power plants, right now, this is an issue internationally. What do we do with it? Where do we put it? Some places want to put it under, into the earth and bury it. And there's a fear that we might forget about it and our future generations will be hurt. I know in Germany, I'm wearing this in solidarity, this yellow X, because they already have a facility in Gorleben, which a friend of mine calls a potato barn. So these are not very safe facilities, and we need to come up with better solutions. Right now in the United States, we have, going to the beginning of the nuclear fuel chain, uranium mining. We have over 15,000 abandoned uranium mines that were created before the United States Environmental Protection Agency existed. So the laws to protect our environment, they didn't start until the 70s. And so a lot of the mining happened before the 70s. And so we're left with a lot of radioactive sites, and people live at these places, and we're still dealing with radioactive water. We're still having, like I mentioned, babies are being born with uranium in their urine. And so this is a big mess that the United States has left and has no law to clean up or to address. Only on the Navajo Nation, they are dealing with about 524 what we call abandoned uranium mine sites. So abandoned means those that were before the 70s. But the local people say this is not the right number. There's more like 2,000 if you count each little site. And the process of cleanup, they call it cleanup. But what's happening is all of that waste just gets buried, and it becomes a permanent radioactive waste site. And right now we have, there's several sites that they say have been cleaned up, but the local people, they want the uranium waste moved away from their homes. And this is very difficult because there's no place to put it. However, there's one place that they're taking waste, which is the only uranium mill in the country, which is located right about here. And that is in another indigenous community. So by cleaning up the Navajo Nation, they're taking some of the waste from our indigenous communities to the Ute Mountain Ute Nation, which is absolutely unconscionable and should not happen. And so this is the reality of what's happening. It needs to change. We need to do a better job when we're talking about cleanup. This map here is a government map. So you notice how clean and pretty it is. But this is a community map that shows the blue spots are where the uranium mills were. And the mills, that's where they processed the uranium. They grinded it and crushed it and used a lot of chemicals to process. So those created even more contamination than the mines. So you can see, the government wants us to look at this picture, but the reality is it's more like this. And right now, this is one of the most contaminated areas in the country when it comes to uranium, because there's a Navajo, we call ourselves Diné, but you might have heard of us as Navajo. Then the Diné community here, the Redwater Pond Road, they live, these are houses here. They live between two uranium mines. One is here, one is here. And then there's another one off the picture, so really three. And then next to a uranium mill. So these all closed like in the 80s. These are no longer operating. There's no uranium operations in New Mexico or the Navajo Nation, but there's, like I said, some of this is supposed to be cleaned up. The idea for cleaning up this mine is to move 1 million cubic yards. I'm not sure, maybe close to 1 million cubic meters approximately. They want to take out all of that mine waste and put it on top of this site here, which is an existing waste site that actually had the world's largest uranium spill in 1979. This is a lot of people never heard of this. The uranium spill happened July 16th, at 5:30 in the morning, which is very coincidental. Tina will tell you why. Because I'll tell you, that's the same time the Trinity test occurred, but in 1945. So at the same time and the same day, this site here, there was a break in their tailings pond where they were storing liquid waste. That dam, the wall holding the waste, broke in the morning at 5:30 in the morning. The liquid waste got into the environment here, and then it met up with a river. So this river carried over 90 million liquid gallons of radioactive waste into the next state, over 100 miles away. And the community today is saying, if you put this waste on top of that other waste, what's going to happen with climate change? Because this is all a floodplain. So they're concerned we're just setting up a future accident. And right now, our government, the Navajo Nation, is calling on the United States to have a congressional hearing about this. This is supposed to have a decision made on Sunday, or maybe not a decision, but Sunday is a deadline for comments from the public. I'll put information in the chat, so if people want to send in comments, we encourage folks to do that. These are the people who live in that community. And I'm almost done with my slides, but I just have a couple more. And any information I'm sharing, I'll be putting more links into the chat. So the community, they've been working on this for a long time, and they don't agree with the cleanup, but it's been very difficult because they're tired of waiting. So this is the mine, and they want to move the waste here. So it's not very far, and this is what they're calling cleanup. So this is the website. I'll put those in the chat. Lastly, I'm just going to wrap up by finishing where this is the first part I talked about was uranium mining, and now I'm going to talk about the waste, which we call the back end. So in the United States, we're fighting two proposals for high-level radioactive waste storage. One is in New Mexico here, and then one is in Texas here. And so my slides here, I'm so sorry, I have there's two maps on this image. Right here, you can see there's uranium deposits. It's not labeled, but these red dots, this is where all the uranium came out. And these these pink circles, that's where the uranium was used in power plants. Now, all of those power plants are getting old and ready to shut down. So some of them, they're already decommissioning, and there's a company called Holtec buying them to decommission them, another company called North Star. These two companies are in business. Holtec actually is proposing the world's largest waste dump here that we're fighting. We think it's going to be licensed in January. This site here in Texas, this was just licensed last month, but the state of Texas is fighting it, just like the state of New Mexico is fighting this, as well as the community and the people. For us as Diné people, here's the site here. My nation is here, and our two sacred mountains, we have 4 major sacred mountains. 2 are along the transport route. So that's where I come in, and across the whole country, we have concerns for all the communities when it comes to transport. This is a call out. I'm asking to invite Indigenous people to join the fight. And okay, I'm sorry, I'm gonna just show this picture again. So this is the uranium deposits. Here are the power plants. And when you put them together, it was that other map over there. But I'm just going to stop now because I talked enough and I'm at my time, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. This final slide shows all the reasons why we're against it. It's actually illegal, but the United States is still pushing it forward. So the nuclear industry, basically they're trying to change the laws in Congress. So this is what we're fighting in the United States. And we really I appreciate this platform, because I know how important it is for our nuclear fights around the world to work together, because we're so small when it comes to our movement compared to the fossil fuel movement. So thank you so much. I'll be ready to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leona. That's really moving stuff. Please hold your questions, or indeed put them into the Q&A function so that we can come to them at the end. We're going to go through all 3 speakers and then a few short presentations, and then we'll come to Q&A. It's good to see the common ground that we have from Scotland to what's happening in the Navajo Nation. There's nuclear weapons and nuclear power as concerns, the links to climate change, the justification for nuclear power on climate change grounds. We have that argument here too. Even fracking, another cause that we share. And it's also interesting to see that the Navajo Nation has managed to ban the transport of radioactive materials, something that we can't yet do in Scotland. So next we're going to hear about another form of colonialism. So the Reverend James Bhagwan is joining us from the Pacific Conference of Churches. He's on his way to the conference of the climate conference in Glasgow, but he's going to talk about the devastating impact of past nuclear testing on Pacific Islands. So we from the UK felt we could blow up bits of Australia and impact indigenous people there. The US felt for some reason that they could blow up bits of Pacific Islands. And of course, those islands not only have that legacy, they're now on the front line of facing the challenges of climate change. So over to you, James. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Richard. And may I say our greeting from Fiji, which is Bula Vinaka. And it translates as, may you have life in abundance. And I think that's an important thing to think about on the eve of COP26. And while we are still discussing the unfinished business of the legacy of nuclear colonialism. And thank you very much, Leona, for your presentation, because I'm just going to carry right on. And when you saw one of the first maps that was shared earlier with the images and the icons of the nuclear explosion, in a big space of ocean in the middle of the map. And that really is the context for what I'm going to share to you, particularly because that ocean is always seen as empty. That's the Pacific Ocean that covers 1/3 of the planet. But it's home to 1/3 of the world's biodiversity and of the world's indigenous languages that cannot be found anywhere else in the world. And so in this situation, we are really also having a conversation around mare nullius, this idea that the ocean is empty. And this is continuing to be played at the moment in the issue of the Indo-Pacific, the growing Indo-Pacific conflict between China, the US, Australia, Japan, and India. And most recently with Australia buying some nuclear-powered submarines from the US. But I'm going to take us back to the end of World War II. And while we have the VE Day in Europe, marking the end of the Second World War in Europe, of course, it happened a little bit later in the Pacific. And the specter of nuclear weapons have brought a shadow to our region since the first atom bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki during the Pacific War, or the Pacific Campaign of the Second World War, as it's known. Radioactive material entered our region as uranium and plutonium-powered weapons bound for Japan were flown from Tinian Atoll in what is now the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas Islands. And those radiation-covered planes returned to the Pacific. Since then, the people and the environment of the Pacific have suffered as the guinea pigs for the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And these experiments designed to secure world domination were undertaken, of course, as we've heard, by the United States, which held 109 tests in the Marshall Islands, in Kiribati, Johnson Atoll, Alaska, and in the open ocean. The United Kingdom held 21 tests in Australia and Kiribati, and France, which held 340 tests in Maui or French Polynesia. If I am to put the impact of these tests on a scale, the uranium-fueled atom bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima had a blast equal to 12 to 15,000 tons of TNT. So 15 megatons of TNT, destroying 5 square miles of the city. The subsequent tests, and I say tests here, in the Pacific, in the 50 years following the end of World War II, from 1946 to 1996 by the US, UK, and France, is the equivalent to 9,010 Hiroshima bombs, or between 108 to 130 kilotons of TNT. Britain conducted 12 nuclear test explosions in Australia between 1952 and 1957, and as well as hundreds of minor trials of radioactive and toxic materials for bomb development up to 1963. And these caused untold health problems for the local indigenous people who were at the highest risk of radiation.
Many of them were not properly evacuated, and some were not informed at all of the testings. On the 17th of July, 1974, a test took place in Tahiti, known as the Centaur test, which was the 41st test that took place in French-occupied Polynesia, and exposed the people of Tahiti to 500 times the maximum allowed level of plutonium fallout, affecting more than 100,000 people. This is the most far-reaching nuclear explosion to take place in our Pacific Ocean. Now today, portions of the Pacific stretching from Eniwetok in the north, in the Marshall Islands, to Kiritimati Island in the central region, in Kiribati, to Mororoa in the eastern Pacific, remain not only uninhabitable, but are gradually leaking toxic effluent into the ocean, our Pacific Ocean, which is the food source of the region and the fishing ground of the world. And today, 3/4 of a century after the Bikini Atoll test by the United States, the people that lived in that once beautiful paradise remain displaced and physically scarred. In the country that I come from, Fiji, along with New Zealand, servicemen from these countries, or at that time Fiji was still a British colony, and their descendants battled the illnesses caused by exposure to radiation from the hydrogen bomb tests, which took place from 1957 to 1958. And a 1/4 of a century after France terminated its nuclear testing program in French Polynesia, their people continue to cry for justice, for compensation, for medical treatment, all as waste slowly but surely leaches into the sea. And currently there are strong indicators of an imminent collapse of the Mororoa Atoll, which will cause the remaining radioactive substances from the French test to spill into the Pacific Ocean. And given the way that our ocean operates with its currents, that nuclear waste will not stay in the Pacific, it will circulate the globe. And so these so-called nuclear powers of the world really must atone for the damage and fear that they have inflicted on our beautiful Pacific and our world. It's the same conversation we are having now in the context of climate change. And to these countries that continue to court the friendship of our Pacific people, we of the Pacific have been saying time and time again, you cannot be our friend if you keep nuclear weapons in your pockets. You cannot be our friends if you do not acknowledge the pain and suffering that you have caused by your tests carried out in our home. And these cries in the Pacific are not only for the people, but for the land and the sea, of which people are an integral part and have a very strong, even spiritual relationship with. And for us at the Pacific Conference of Churches, we firmly believe that God created the world in which we live as a means to sustain humankind, to provide life through water, air, food, and shelter. And so our world must end any possibility of nuclear war. There must be no chance of even one weapon ever being detonated again. And for many of us in the Pacific, this is also a call for justice and reparation for the Pacific's forced role in nuclear testing. And that justice must take place now. And this is a question of justice, the legacy of the quest for justice that we are talking about, particularly as we come to COP26, which is starting in a few days in your towns and cities of Glasgow. So I thank you for this opportunity and look forward to the opportunity to have more dialogue with you in the question and answer time. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you very much, James. And that's a horrific tale of impacts. Almost inconceivable that we in our sophisticated modern world could do this and also not own up to it. But actually I remember blockading the French consulate in Edinburgh about Mororoa testing in the 90s. It's within many people's memory that this was apparently something the Western world was doing. So thank you very much. We're going to move straight on. We'll move to Tina Cordova, who co-founded and works for the Tularosa Basin Downwinders Consortium in New Mexico. She works seeking justice for the victims of the Trinity test, the Manhattan Project's first nuclear bomb, and other tests. So over to you, Tina.
Good day to everybody. I'm calling in, or zooming in, I guess, from beautiful New Mexico in the southwest region of the United States. I have so much in common with James and Leona, and am very grateful for this time to educate people about what took place during the Manhattan Project and the ensuing testing of the first nuclear device that exposed the community I'm part of to high levels of radiation. My name is Tina Cordova. I've been doing this work for over 16 years. I've dedicated a great deal of my life to bringing social justice to the people of New Mexico who were the first victims of an atomic bomb blast. What I hope to do today is educate you around the Trinity test itself. I want to talk about the lifestyles of the people in rural parts of New Mexico in 1945 that led to their severe overexposure to radiation. I want to talk to you about testing that took place other places in the United States, the test ban treaty that was established under President Kennedy, and then I want to talk to you about the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. And I know that's a lot, but I'm pretty sure I can get it done in 15 minutes. So first of all, we have to, as we reflect on the Trinity test, we have to remember that that was the first test ever conducted of a nuclear device any place in the world. And there were things that were absolutely known, and then there were things that weren't known. The things that were absolutely known at the time, in July 16th, 1945, is that radiation exposure was very harmful to human health. That was a well-known fact in 1945. The other thing that was known about Trinity specifically is that there was going to be fallout produced, and because the test had to take place that morning, our president was going to participate in a meeting and with Stalin, and so this test had to go off that morning so he could report on the results of the test in Potsdam. And so there was no delay. The test had to take place, and that's our rainy season. We live in the desert Southwest, but we truly do have a rainy season here where we actually receive the major part of precipitation that we receive here. So we have these massive thunderstorms that move in almost every day in July and August, and sometimes September if we're lucky, but it's our rainy season. And they absolutely knew that because they were testing a device like this in the desert during the rainy season, that there would be massive fallout and that it would be spread in a very wide circle around the Trinity test site. What they didn't know, though, is exactly how to test a device like this to minimize fallout, and they didn't know exactly how much plutonium would be necessary to make sure that the device detonated. And so the bomb was incredibly inefficient. It was placed on a tower 100 feet off the ground, which was a huge mistake as it relates to how to test a device and limit fallout. What happened is the blast force came down, intercepted the earth, took up an enormous amount of dirt, sand, animal and plant life, incinerated it because it produced 10 times the heat of the sun, and then spread it into this fireball that rose over 7 miles past the atmosphere into the stratosphere. None of that part was anticipated. When you detonate a device 100 feet off the ground, it's far too close to the ground to safely do. And so that was never repeated, ever, ever, ever in our government's history of testing nuclear devices. The other thing is that they packed it with 13 pounds of weapons-grade plutonium when only 3 pounds were necessary for the fission process. Plutonium has a half-life of 24,000 years. You only have to inhale, ingest, or absorb 1 particle of plutonium, and it remains in your body for the remainder of time, giving off radiation, damaging cells, damaging tissue, and damaging organs, and eventually leading to the cancers that we see so prevalent here in New Mexico. So a full 10 pounds of that weapons-grade plutonium went up in that fireball that exceeded the atmosphere and then rained down in a form of ash that spread all over what's called the Tularosa Basin, or the area between 2 large mountain ranges where the blast took place. The other thing that's very important to note about this is that because it was during our rainy season and we had a massive thunderstorm afterwards, That likely brought down the biggest particles of radiation that day, just subsequent to the detonation of the bomb. Those particles would have been very dangerous to human health. Now let's talk about lifestyles in 1945 so we can better understand how people were exposed. Well, number one, we didn't have running water, okay? And that's very important in the history of this. Because we didn't have running water, we collected water off of our rooftops into what's called a cistern system, a closed containment vessel, where the water flowed off of the rooftops and where it was stored and was a very valuable resource and commodity because, you know, we live in the desert. So that water was very valuable to people. We also had open irrigation ditch systems. The little town I grew up in, which is essentially 45 miles away the crows fly from the Trinity test site, we have the largest, what's called acequia, that's a Spanish word for ditch system. We have the largest ditch system in New Mexico. And the people relied on the water that flowed from the mountain ranges on either side of the test site. Okay, people relied on the water that flowed down from there into these ditches to water their crops because everybody had a garden and everybody had an orchard. Okay, and so now our water systems were completely contaminated. The water resource of the rivers and lakes surrounding the Trinity site were completely contaminated. We didn't have electricity in 1945 in rural parts of New Mexico. We didn't have refrigeration. Because of that, you couldn't go to a grocery store, for example, and buy dairy or produce or meat. All of those things were produced by you and your family at your home. We had gardens and orchards. We had milk cows and dairies. We raised sheep, pigs, goats, chickens for meat, and we hunted. Men went out and hunted on a very regular basis to supplement our food supply. Now all of those animals that we depended on were eating grasses and grazing on grasses that were completely contaminated by the radioactive ash that fell from the sky for days after the test. Our complete food supply was now affected. And the women in July, this would have been the peak of the harvest for us. They would have been canning and drying everything they could get their hands on from their gardens. I always tell people, in the little town where I grew up in, with the running water in the ditches that surrounded our homes, we had these massive orchards and gardens, and I can remember going from one tree to the other and eating fresh peaches and apricots and peaches and apples and plums, and we have, you know, everything imaginable, pecans and walnuts, and just an abundance of these things grew in our yards. And so we never had a struggle for producing our food, and we relied on the earth and we relied on the water. So now we were maximally exposed. We were inhaling the ash as it fell from the sky. We were ingesting it through our food supply and through our water resource. And then if you don't have running water, you don't bathe as often. And as the ash fell from the sky, it likely got on your scalp and on your skin. And because you don't bathe as often, it remains there until the next time that you're able to bathe, and you're now absorbing it through your skin. It's no wonder that so many people were made sick. Now, the people in New Mexico lived as close as 12 miles to the test site. We've well documented families that lived on ranches as close as 12 miles to the test site. Our government went back to some of these ranches and took the cows who had their hides burned off of them away, but they didn't take all of them. And people tell the stories about how their cows turned white or half white afterwards because, you know, they were exposed to high levels of radiation, and they talked about all the eye cancer that the cows had. No one was warned before or after the Trinity test to take care with their health, and we were basically left on our own to deal with this. Now, I'm a cancer survivor. I had thyroid cancer at the age of 39, and the first thing they asked me was, when were you exposed to radiation? Did you ever work in a lab with radioactive isotopes? Did you ever work in an x-ray facility? Have you had a lot of x-rays? And I said, no, 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 and no. But I lived 45 miles from the Trinity test site, and I know that was my exposure. I'm the fourth generation in my family to have cancer since 1955. Two of my great-grandfathers that were alive at the time of the test, living in Tularosa, where I grew up, both got stomach cancer in 1955, 10 years after the test, at a time when no one had ever heard the word cancer in our community. There was no treatment for them. There were no medical facilities for them. They were given morphine and sent home to die, and it was horrible. Both of my grandmothers had cancer. My father died after suffering for over 8 years with cancers he didn't have risk factors for. My father first developed cancer at the base of his tongue, and then at the front of his tongue 8 years later. These two cancers were not related. They knew that on a cellular level. And in between those two cancers, my dad got prostate cancer. My dad suffered horrifically, and he had great medical care, great insurance. We took him to some of the best doctors and hospitals available. My dad didn't drink, didn't use chewing tobacco, didn't smoke cigarettes, had no viruses. And I asked the doctors, how is it that he got these horrific cancers without risk factors? And they said, we don't know, but we see a lot of this in New Mexico. My sister's right now undergoing treatment for cancer. My mother's sister died from cancer. My aunt, who's 81 years old, and my dad's older sister just finished going through the radiation treatment she had to receive for her breast cancer. And my family has been in some ways spared. I know families that have lists with 30 to 40 family members who've had cancer on them. There's been testing take place other places besides New Mexico, as was referred to by James. Nevada test site is one of the locations they went to. New Mexico was downwind of the Nevada test site through the above ground testing. Our government finally decided to stop the above ground testing because a group of advocates similar to me and Leona asked for people to submit their children's teeth as they shed them. And people started sending in their children's baby teeth, and this baby teeth project developed out of that. And those children's teeth were showing high levels of strontium. And they had teeth from all 50 states in our country. That is when President Kennedy finally said, we can no longer do this. We're poisoning our own children in the process of doing above ground testing. They conducted over 100 above ground tests at the Nevada test site. And then when they signed the test ban treaty in 1963, they continued to do below ground testing, and there's no level of safe testing, everything vents. But they also renamed some of the tests, and they called them plowshares tests. And these tests were done to look at using nuclear devices in construction processes. And for example, in the Four Corners area on the Navajo Nation, where Leona is from, they actually placed a nuclear device 4,000 feet underground to frack gas, natural gas, and they produced a lot of natural gas, and all of it was radioactive, and they never traced the nuclear fallout or tracked the nuclear fallout. That test was called gas buggy. There were other tests as part of this process done in New Mexico. So New Mexico, much like what Leona said, we have been long ago declared a sacrifice zone. The government has never come back to New Mexico to take care of the people here through what's called the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. And right now we're fighting very hard in Congress to be added to the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. The bill will sunset in July of 2021. This bill has been around for 31 years, taking care of people downwind of the Nevada test site, but it has never taken care of the people in New Mexico. And they arbitrarily set the limits for uranium miners as anybody who mined uranium prior to 1971, as if it became safe to mine uranium after 1971. And the reason the government did the cutoff at 71 is because that's when uranium became commercially available, and our government decided that industry would take care of you if you became sick, and we all know what happens when it's left up to industry. So I am going to wrap it up there. We're working very hard on these new bills passed in Congress, and I'll look forward to answering any questions that anyone might have. I appreciate the opportunity to speak. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much, Tina. That was a really moving, vivid description of life in the 40s in New Mexico, and why the impact of the Trinity test was so great on those people because of how they lived, and also a personal testament of those involved and the impacts on families, real people. I think something that ran through all three speakers was a positive note of change that communities can make by campaigning together. So there was a lot of quite depressing stuff there, but there was also the fact that we can work together and we can actually make change fighting this. So we're into questions and answers. We have one question, and there's been some very interesting information and links in the chat as well that I'd urge you to have a look at. Just before we get to the questions, I wondered if Maureen Penjueli would like to say a few words, who's been able to join us from the Pacific Network on Globalization.
Good evening, and Nisambula Vinaka. Wonderful to see some familiar faces from the Pacific. Thank you for the opportunity to say a few words. Thank you, Reverend James, for really bringing the Oceania Pacific case forward. Perhaps just three key additional points. And the first is, in terms of the history of the Pacific, I think it's always important to remember that we also are dealing with contaminated radioactive waste. This is particularly from the Fukushima case, in which the Japanese government this year announced that they would dump 1 million tons of wastewater into the Pacific Ocean. It's strongly being denounced by both Pacific Island governments, civil society, and movements across the Pacific. But again, long history in the Pacific, including in terms of nuclear energy and the dumping of radioactive waste into the ocean. I think the second key point is the additions to Australia, the UK, and the US, the AUKUS announcement. And this is really important, particularly because a lot of investment is going into Australia's purchasing of these nuclear submarines at a time when we know we need more financing for climate change, the impacts that Reverend James talked about. So we're seeing defense spending in key countries like Australia, the UK, and the US being driven into maintaining these kinds of security pacts. More concerning in terms of this AUKUS announcement is really the defense pact between Australia and the US, which really includes the home basing of American submarines, surface vessels and bombers, and the stockpile of ammunition. So I think that's a key point. And the final key thing, so that we don't really always end up in really kinds of very depressing scenarios, is again, just to pick up from the last speaker, Lynn's point, which is really on the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. For us in the Pacific, 10 Pacific Island countries, we have signed, ratified the treaty. This is quite a significant achievement around global solidarity, our ability to make change. Of course, the nuclear-powered states haven't signed on, and that's quite clear. But for Pacific Island countries and part of the nuclear legacy issues, Articles 6 and 7 to address environmental remediation, victims assistance, international cooperation and assistance is quite fundamental. So those are just the three key points that I wanted to add to the discussion tonight. And thank you again for the opportunity.